Clive Chip Chapman is a retired Major General in the British military. He spent years as a paratrooper, an instructor. He deployed to battle zones. He was an advisor to America's CENTCOM, Central Command, and he was also the head of counterterrorism and UK operations in the Ministry of Defense. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Dana.
As we speak, President Zelensky is in the United States this week. He'll talk to the UN, and then he'll also meet with President Biden. What do you think kind of unfettered that he will tell President Biden? What message do you think will be important coming directly from President Zelensky to the White House?
Well, the first thing is he, of course, needs unlimited and continuing support. So that's both from an American perspective and the international community's perspective. And of course, in terms of capabilities, they still need certain capabilities, including the long-range ATACMS, and it would be useful if they had more tanks and more F-16s and in a more timely fashion. So that's the first thing. And there are always these three variables about internal support, alliance support, and perceptions of Russia, which cloud how things are done within the framework of will the war end or not. The second thing I think is the United Nations General Assembly meetings are always important. And I recall that at the first year anniversary of the war, there was a vote which took place on a non-binding resolution, which was that Russia should end its violence and Russia should withdraw its troops. Now, only 6 countries voted against that. Adding to Russia, of course, that was Belarus, Syria, Eritrea, North Korea, Mali, and Nicaragua. So he'll be trying to reinforce the morality and the ethics of the Ukrainian position in the United Nations General Assembly. I think that's a given. And I think there'll also be some background talk about Russia's position on the Security Council. Now, this is an interesting one because technically there is a procedure called the credentials procedure, which could lead to a vote at some time about Russia being voted off the United Nations Security Council. Now, people might say, well, that's absolutely farcical. But of course, when the UN Charter came about in 1945, it wasn't Russia that occupied the position in the Security Council. It was the USSR. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was then just by default that Russia occupied that position. But it could have been Belarus, it could have been Ukraine. And if you've broken the UN Charter, you could make a good legal and moral case that that should pertain. It has happened once before with South Africa, I think in 1971. And the route you do the credentials procedure could mean that you couldn't be vetoed by a UN, a P5 member to do that. So I think those are the 3 strands which we'll see in Zelensky's visit this week.
Because you've just mentioned the UN Security Council, which is never before, according to the head of the UN, Guterres, it says, never before have we been paralyzed like this. I mean, unable to agree on anything between China and the United States, Russia. And he says, and never before has the need been greater for the Security Council to be effective and to take action. Are you hearing that there's actually some traction in that discussion? I mean, is that some kind of, something that people kind of joke about over coffee? Or do you think there's really traction in removing Russia from the Security Council?
I think it should become a basis for talking about it. But of course, there are always these centrifugal and centripetal forces going both ways. And we saw this in a way with what came out of the G20 in the last couple of weeks, where I would say we got to the point of discursive diplomacy. And what I mean by discursive diplomacy was there really wasn't any substantive statement about the war in Ukraine and Russia's position within it, i.e. that they'd invaded. And I call it discursive diplomacy because effectively they were discussing everything else but that key point. So we've really gone from a position where prior to the war we had coercive diplomacy, Russia trying to achieve its objectives by diplomacy, giving to our demands or else. then to a position where we've invaded and are still really within the war have a position of giving to our demands or else. That is, what's ours is ours and what's yours is negotiable. And now we've got to this position of discursive diplomacy. So it could gain traction. It's still a fairly low percentage of that happening at the moment, but it's one of those scenarios that one could see for the future. And like all these things, there are no certainties, there are only scenarios in the future, both in diplomacy and on the battlefield.
Right, here's another scenario for you. What if, you're right, President Zelensky no doubt will be in the White House saying more, give me more. Give me more ammunition, maybe give me ATACMS, which I want to ask you about. Give me, to Germany, that they will ask for these other missiles, the Taurus missiles, I think. What if President Biden is just looking down the election road, increasingly seeing the Republicans, capitalize on the $70 billion, that's the number now, $70 billion that has gone to Ukraine, and she starts reading the room and just says, I'm not going to give more, because that's not going to help the Democrats win the presidential race. Is there another scenario where Ukraine can continue on with the support of others without America's full support?
Well, of course, in a way, I sort of said that the three variables there are internal politics within a country, alliance politics, and perceptions of Russia. So in an internal politics, of course, we have a fairly fractured House of Representatives, where we have, particularly from the Republican side, the Freedom Caucus, which is trying to either make sure that either a supplemental in the spending in terms of Ukrainian support, or some sort of other mechanism is tied into other spending cuts. That is essentially why we've got a bit of a hiatus at the moment. And of course, the end of the financial year in America is the end of September. And so that's why we've got that discussion at the moment. Now, in terms of the Democratic Party, the support for the Democrat from those who support the Democrats is still a lot higher than those from the Republican Party, who would give willing support to Ukraine. And of course, there looms the spectre not of the end of September and shutting down the government, that almost happens on a yearly basis, or did when I was in America, but of course the spectre of the November 24 election. Now, of course, again, in scenario terms, the war could be over by November 24. It could also be a long war. So in a long war scenario, the longest I ever saw of when someone articulating a time frame, I'm not sure on what basis she did this, was when Liz Truss, before she became Prime Minister and was our Foreign Secretary in the UK at the time, suggested that the war in Ukraine could last for 10 years. Now, again, there are no certainties, there are scenarios. The long war scenario is something that no one really had planned for. And of course, there was a theory, certainly from Mark Milley, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that there were a number of myths that we needed to get rid of. One of those myths is, of course, that wars will be short. Now, he said that originally in 2017 when he was the chief of the army. And of course, in the 5 years onwards from that particular, or before we got to the Ukrainian or Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22, you could argue that it did look like wars were short. The Nagorno-Karabakh war was 44 days, Op Guardians of the War in Israel, Hamas, 10 days. But this isn't. This is a long war. And one of the things about wars which look to be becoming long is that the least likely time for a ceasefire in wars is generally around the 2-year mark. Now, the offensive from Ukraine hasn't petered out yet. I don't think it will, at least for the next month. And that's also an interesting one in looking at the variables of what the Defense Intelligence Agency said recently on the 8th of September, that they said that there was a realistic possibility of Ukraine breaking through both the second and third lines of defense, which would put them within fire control range of the M14. That's the key highway which links Melitopol to Mariupol, and therefore could sever the line of communications and put Crimea at risk, with the time frame which Mark Milley articulated on the 10th of September, which was that there were only 30 or 40 to 45 days fighting time left this year, based on either the weather, reserves, lack of supplies, and all those things. So
Yeah,
you've got
and a lot of people would debate that time frame, but okay, he said.
Yeah, I don't think fighting stops because of that, and there are lots of examples in history which would tell you that, in climates which are far worse, and pedology, soil science, which is far worse than that in that part of the world. This is not the Pripyat marshes, and neither is it the Finnish front from 1940, when, of course, Russia was very successful in a counterattack there, which brought the Winter War of 1939 to 1940 to a conclusion.
I was going to save this, but I mean, you've deeply waded into what's happening in Ukraine and in the war front. So let me just ask you about that. So I heard an interview that you did recently where you said, and I'm saying this, not you, but you kind of I think evaporated this idea that it's frozen. You laid out some pretty critical, linear, step-by-step advances that Ukraine is taking, and a lot of that centered on Crimea, that they're just not hitting and running, and we're having a headline 1 or 2 days later in a newspaper, but in fact they are chipping away critically and methodically, and advancing. So can you, as a military man, sort of lay that out for me and tell me, how do you read that, and why do you think they're being successful right now, and in a very logical, linear way?
Well, I think to understand that, you need to understand the framework of the battlefield. So in terms of the framework of the battlefield, we talk about close operations, sort of force-on-force fighting, which you're seeing particularly around the sort of Bakhmut, south of Bakhmut, north of Bakhmut areas, and in Zaporizhia with the advances on Bobatine and that towards Zydovny. So that is the close battle. Now, the really important thing here is the deep battle, that beyond the close battle, which sets the conditions for what you want to achieve at the operational level in the future. Now, the operational level, we really talk about that tactical battles are sequenced to achieve operational effect, and the operational effects that they're going after at the moment to set that condition for either a reoccupation of Ukraine or for a collapse of the Russian morale, either military morale, political morale, because one of the decisive battles might be in the Kremlin, or in the elite defections, is in what they've been doing in terms of what we call the A2AD battle. That's anti-access area denial battle. And what they're very cleverly doing is having really a kind of attrition by overstretch. They're putting multiple dilemmas in the way of the Russians, getting inside their sort of decision cycle about what they should do. If you look at that in terms of what's been happening around Crimea in that part of the deep battle, there have been 4 things there which have really occurred in the last 2 to 3 weeks, which have been really important. The first one was the significant hit on Cape Tar-Hakkut around the end of August, which sort of took out a number of electronic warfare systems, radars, and an S-400 system, one of the long-range over-the-horizon surface-to-air missile systems of the Russians. So that was the first enabler to make them get closer. The second one was the Boyko Goplaps, that's the gas and oil platforms. So again, by eroding the electronic warfare and some of the sensors there, you're making the airspace management from a Ukraine perspective easier, and that means you can bring more assets to bear with a greater probability of success. Because one of the things you look at is what we call MEA, munitions effectiveness assessment. The third thing then, which that enabled those 2 things, was the really successful strike on the base at Sevastopol with the submarine being destroyed along with the landing craft. And that landing craft is really important in terms of landing craft and the dry dock in terms of two things. Firstly, the loss of maintenance facilities for the Russians. And secondly, if the Ukrainians are able to sever the land bridge and at some time significantly destroy, we'll call it, the Kerch bridge, then the supply line that runs through to Ukraine effectively by land has gone. And therefore you can only really supply it by kind of sea. And those landing craft have actually been utilized as supply ships as much as anything. So that is now two that have been destroyed effectively. So you're chipping away. And if you do that in the deep battle, there comes a point when it's not, well, when Putin really has a choice, it's guns or butter, because you can't do both with the logistic support to the population and the military in Crimea. And that's why the decisive battle might be in the Kremlin, because Crimea, from his perspective, is deemed to be kind of holy land. Now, it either is, and they all fight for it, or it's not, and there's a significant consequence for Putin at home.
So, I mean, there's a lot of analysis that say that the Ukrainians don't necessarily have to take Crimea, that just by cutting it off and making it untenable for Russian forces, that they can collapse the Russian army. I don't know, but they can certainly collapse that major launch pad, which is being used to attack Ukraine.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, we always really talk about two parts to war, a physical part and a psychological part. And I think we're already seeing some of those psychological ripples, which can be amplified. And in sort of military theory terms here, again, we're really talking about Clausewitzian trinity. So wars really end. I mean, fighting stops either because of decisive military victory, the improbability of military victory, or because the costs, either militarily, economic, industrial, whatever, are too great. Now, in Clausewitzian terms, that translates into the military no longer are able or willing to fight. And we saw that, for example, in 1917, when 2.5 million people walked off the battlefields of the Russian army, which led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Or we could see it in the collapse of the political polity. That is why the decisive battle might be in the Kremlin in terms of the psychological aspect of the prisoner's dilemma, one of the great psychological models. Do you stay loyal or do you defect? That was the same sort of thing that we really saw around the Prigozhin. Or the third thing is that the government defects, and that is elite defections, because the consequences for those, the Siloviki, the men of force around him, is too great. In that situation, it is the security services who become important in the future in czar making. Now, that doesn't mean if Putin goes that you're going to have a regime of sweetness and light in Russia. You might just have someone who's even worse than Putin. But that doesn't mean that you still don't have the same dilemmas about, you know, could he, for example, either Putin or a successor mobilize the country either economically or in manpower terms to continue this war? And that's one of the key dilemmas he also faces at the moment.
What if Biden says yes to ATACMS? Can you, in layman terms, a lot of people don't even know what that is. It's the Army Tactical Missile System. If Biden says yes to ATACMS, they get more range. What happens on the battlefield, and can happen pretty quickly?
Well, what it does is it pushes this A2AD bubble backwards. So the anti-axis area denial of the weapon of the Russians is pushed further back, giving the Ukrainians greater access to using other systems to attack. So, for example, early in the war, we heard a lot about TB2 Bayraktar. Now, although things are limited by range and payload and all that sort of stuff, it brings other systems to bear, and brings systems to bear which previously have been either jammed by electronic warfare, being able to shot over the sky. So the extended range of ATACMS, and of course, if the Germans do give Taurus, which you mentioned earlier on, Dana, just pushes this ability of the Russians to control the airspace further back. And that again means that the Ukrainians can prosecute a deep battle more effectively on high value targets. They're not going after, small things. It's high-value targets. That's why you see these S-400s being taken out, electronic warfare systems, big logistic dumps, command and control nodes, the things which really, both the brains of an operation and the things which give you the real big enablers for the future.
Will you comment on North Korea? And we don't know what the deal was behind closed doors, but they have a lot more to offer than just millions of rounds of old artillery shells. I mean, they have some other weapon systems. Presumably, Putin is going to get access to that. Is it a big factor, do you think, when you kind of went through the shopping list of what is available from North Korea to Russia?
It's not a done deal yet. I mean, of course, we know that the number of artillery systems in the North Korean inventory is stunningly large. And that is why, for example, in the first three to 4 days of any war, should there be one in the Korean Peninsula across the 38th parallel, the left and right of arc in terms of casualties from a South Korean perspective is between 30,000 and 300,000. Now, that variable is so great because of the proximity to Seoul, to the DMZ, i.e. it's within artillery range 25 miles away. Now, one of the key things is really what ammunition and systems and of what age do they give them. Now, one of the big differences historically between NATO countries and Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it was, is the way that they manage stocks and stock inventory. So the NATO countries had far lower operational stocks because the thing about munitions is that they degrade. So propellants degrade, rocket motors degrade, and that is one of the things, for example, why in inventory terms, not looking at the North Koreans, but looking at the Americans on ATACMS, some of the ATACMS are 30 years old and therefore were taken out of the sort of operational stocks of the Americans. But if they looked at them, which they are, and then sort of said, this is still fit to go, or if we replace a rocket motor, then it could still be used. That's why you often see a mismatch between inventories when we look at this from a NATO perspective. So it really depends on what they give them. If they give them stuff which was manufactured last year, and assuming that North Korean tolerances of manufacturing are pretty good, that could be a worry. If they give them stuff which is 30, 40, 50 years old, because the North Koreans have not fought anything significant encounters since 1953, it could actually be more dangerous to the Russians. So again, like all these things, there's a big variable about what, if anything, they give them and what quality that is.
Major General Chapman, I have traveled Russia as a correspondent there, and I can tell you, I mean, the one thing that I can bring to the discussion is that when you take a look at some of the secret cities and the manufacturing base, whatever they're able to kickstart from Soviet times is incredible. I mean, this is a country that can produce weapons, probably like no other. Maybe the United States can, but there is a huge assembly line out there waiting and gaining steam. So your overall assessment of the war in Ukraine, I think sometimes the media is too positive, taking the fall of a village and crediting Ukraine with a major advancement, and maybe it's not. Sometimes we're too negative because we have short attention spans, and war takes a long time to play out in the battlefield. So, when you get us to shut up for a minute, the media people who don't always know enough about warfare but talk about it all the time, what is your feeling? What's your assessment in terms of where this is headed, and is there enough sand, in the clock as it drips down for Ukraine to be able to get this done with Western support continuing?
Well, a lot of media commentators and military commentators, including Mark Milley from time to time, have said that Russia has already lost tactically, operationally, and strategically. Now, of course, I don't take that view because, again, it's really to do with the fact that there are so many multiple scenarios. There are so many variables, and you have to look at the sort of time frames that Russia sort of works in. and really the fact that I always say that leaders may change, Putin could go. Vital interests rarely change, and we sort of think we know that how Russia has defined its vital interests, regain lost territory and spheres of influence. But geography doesn't change. So like all these things, you could either have a frozen peace and a land for peace, which would reward the aggressor. But that doesn't mean that ultimately, if you look in grand strategic terms and in terms of vital interests, that the thing would be over, because grand strategic vital interest should be measured in tens of years, not in 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. So it is far too early to say that Russia has lost at any of those levels, tactically, operationally, or strategically. Of course, it would be, you could say at the moment that tactically, Russia, to my mind, is being outfought and outthought by the Ukrainians, but tactical success is not the building block necessarily of strategic success. So we will have to wait and see, as they always say.
Major General Chip Chapman, sir, what a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate your time. It's an honor to get some of your thoughts. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.